This morning's speaker is Professor Simon Glendinning, who's head of LSE's European Institute and a professor in European philosophy at LSE. And today we're marking the publication of his new book last month, Europe, A Philosophical History, 2 volumes which are the culmination of over 5 years' work and explore what philosophy can contribute to our understanding of Europe. And I think the philosophy of history is actually an academic discipline that Simon invented, if that's the right word. So we're in for a treat today, and I will hand over to Simon right away. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you everybody for coming. I certainly didn't invent philosophy of history, but and I'm not quite sure I can take the title of an inventor of the philosophy of Europe. On the other hand, as a sub-area of philosophy, it's certainly not well populated. People will be familiar perhaps with themes in the philosophy of mind or the philosophy of language or the philosophy of law and so on. Well, philosophy of Europe should be a topic, but one might wonder what one would do if one was trying to do that. And this work that I've been undertaking over the last few years has been trying to work out what a philosopher would do if they were going to talk about Europe. And well, there are various things that one could do, and certainly some things that some people think that I am doing. But I'll just mention a couple of those things before I really get going. Because what I am interested in is a certain kind of entangling of Europe with philosophy. And there are various ways in which one might think about that entanglement. A very common view is that entanglement of philosophy and Europe is due to the fact that Europe has been the cradle of philosophy. It's cultivated it, it's protected it. And if you look at a history of philosophy, you'll find very often books with titles like From Socrates to Sartre, and there won't be much in it that isn't European in origin. Of course, the word philosophy is a Greek word, and there may be things going on elsewhere in the world that should be called philosophy, but under that Greek name, it has a profoundly European memory. And so you might think that what I'm doing when I'm trying to do a philosophical history of Europe would just be to say something about that extraordinary lineage of thinkers that make up the history of philosophy. Well, I'm not doing that. And I'll try and explain a bit about why I'm not doing that. A second thought might be, if not a cradle of philosophy, perhaps Europe and philosophy have a shared place of birth. And that's something that was perhaps already in view when I talked about the word philosophy being a Greek word. We could think about the roots of Europe and the roots of philosophy belonging to the same time and place, to the time and place of Greek antiquity. And so you'll have books with titles like From Plato to NATO, which, as it were, draw out that arrival on the scene of a certain kind of European world and a certain way of thinking about things in philosophy. So you'd have one idea might be that the entanglement is because Europe is the cradle, or you might think there's an entanglement because Europe and philosophy have the same place of birth. Well, the kind of approach that I'm taking in my work differs from both of these. It's not that Europe is the cradle of philosophy, but that Europe is itself born from the idea of philosophy. That Europe is itself, in a certain way, a philosophical phenomenon. That is to say that if we are to understand what Europe is, or to understand what it means to be a European, in a certain way, the terms of trade of that understanding of what Europe is, or what it means to be European, will be drawn from philosophy. Now, one idea that we can bring out straight away with the idea that Europe itself is born from the idea of philosophy is a certain kind of ambition, culturally speaking, that what would characterize the particularity of Europe as a regional culture among many across the globe is its interest in going beyond regional particularity towards what one might call a humanly universal way to be. So that movement beyond particularity towards the universal, a culture that would root itself not simply in locally accepted norms, but norms of conduct with something like a universal validity. And you can think of science and philosophy as well, of course, as ambitions with this kind of shaping, norms of conduct that aim to have a universal validity. A wonderful sort of example of this sort of attitude towards one's activity is found in geometry. Geometry doesn't concern itself with this or that flat surface, or this or that three-sided figures, or this or that circle, but an ideally flat surface, or an ideal triangle, or an ideal circle, and so on. And it's as it were governed by norms of an ideal of something or other. And one might extrapolate this adventurously to every walk of life, that you want to get something which is, as it were, ideally beautiful, or ideally musical, or ideally philosophical, or ideally scientific, and so on. So ideas of ideal norms, very important there. All of those, however, come together in an idea of an ideal of humanity, or the idea especially of the perfectibility of humanity. If you think about human beings as capable of advancing beyond any attained condition towards an improved, better condition for what it is to be a human being, that perhaps even approaches a kind of ideal form of life for individuals and for us in a society, one might think that one would have to imagine that as making a transition from circumstances in which we're caught up in war towards circumstances in which we become increasingly peaceful. You might think of this as moving from conditions in which we're mostly dependent and unfree towards conditions in which we're increasingly free. And as a result of both of those, perhaps a movement for humanity towards becoming increasingly happy. Peace, freedom, well-being might be thought of as it were as ends of human life that are good, and that a proper way to be a human being would be striving towards those ends. And if Europe has concerned itself with these kinds of ideals of what it means to be a human being, what it is to live together as human beings, this would be a certain kind of promise that belongs internally to this regional culture, amongst others. And it's very important to see that an idea of history is built into this picture. It's, as it were, a picture of the humanization of humanity over time. Humanity moving from more or less primitive, perhaps savage, perhaps barbarian early beginnings, to becoming increasingly modern, rational, scientific. This kind of idea of the historical development of humanity from human animality towards civilized humanity, again, this idea of a history of the human being is absolutely inseparable from Europe's own understanding of itself, and it's an understanding of what it is to be human and to become human, to become fully human, that comes from philosophy. So here we have a very deep entanglement between the self-understanding of Europe as a distinctively modern society, breaking from myth, magic, superstition, perhaps religion, and breaking into a condition which is enlightened, rational, scientific, free, peaceful, and ultimately, hopefully, harmoniously happy. It's a picture of history as the unfolding of the human being in time, from a primitive to a civilized condition, but which is, as it were, running like a golden thread through that development would be the self-realization of the human being as a rational being, as a rational animal. It's the emancipation or progress of the human conceived as a rational being. So that at the earliest stages of the human appearance in the world, you'd have a rational potential, but history would be the movement of that rational potential to becoming actual through self-realization of a rational being. That's the picture of time and history that belongs to the human as it is understood by the European. So the European understanding of time and history is bound up with this particular conception of what it is to be a human being, what in the various languages of Europe would be called a word corresponding to the English man. Man as a distinctive animal, separate in some ways from all other animals, in virtue of its possession of what we could call reason. And this conception of man as the rational animal is itself a philosophical conception. It's not drawn from empirical inquiries into what human beings do and tend to do. It's a philosophical anthropology. Has its roots again in Greek antiquity, in the Aristotle called the human being. Here's some Greek for you. The zoon logon echon. Zoon logon echon. Zoon is the living thing. Logon echon, it's the living thing with the capacity for the logos, for what could be translated in various words, but was translated in the Latin of the Roman Republic as ratio, as reason. So the living thing with the capacity for reason, the rational animal. This is our inheritance from philosophy, right inside our self-understanding. And history is then understood as the movement of the rational animal attaining to itself as the animal that it is. Now, that history of the rational animal is what philosophers call history approached as a universal history. It's not the history of this or that particular region of the world. It's not a local cultural history, but the history of man, or as a rational being. But that history, which is just what is happening for them, that doesn't appear, as it were, on the world stage all at once and in one go. It first appears as an idea of our history in about the 1700s. And there in Europe, they began to see themselves not only as participating in a universal history, but as it were, for the first time, human beings understanding themselves in terms of the very history in which they're participating. Europe becoming, as it were, the site of the self-development of the rational animal to its greatest extent up hitherto, by becoming the site of the coming to consciousness of history as a universal history, with Europe at the head of the pack. That was the European governing idea, that in this movement of history as a universal history, and that really is what I mean by a philosophical history, Europe in a philosophical history understands itself as the vanguard of human self-development, of human emancipation and progress on the way to the promise of peace, freedom, and well-being for all humanity. Europe at the head of the pack. So it's not just a philosophical history of man that belongs to Europe's self-understanding. It's also a Eurocentric history of man. Europe itself placing itself in a certain way as having this epochal centrality to universal history. Europe thinking of itself and its own history as inseparable from its rational, scientific, philosophical culture. The culture whose interest is, as the LSE might put it, to understand the causes of things, putting our minds to understanding everything in the most objective possible terms. Now, philosophical history of this universal history type began its life as histories which were philosophical, based on the idea of the rational animal, but also religious. They were based on the idea that the rational animal has this characteristic because it's made in the likeness of God. And the reason in man is the divine in man. In its own history, philosophical history shifts from being philosophical and religious in this way to becoming itself philosophical and scientific. As it were, it attains to itself within its own history. But it's still an idea of philosophical history as it moves into the 19th and 20th centuries is still an idea of there being a redeeming end of history, a kind of finality for our politics that moves towards some rational ideal of a way to be for man. And even if it's given up on religious hopes, there's still an idea of emancipation and progress built right in to the European understanding of itself and of history. History in its religious conception is history after the fall of man. But that idea of the fall can be naturalized in various ways as a certain kind of primitive beginning that we move away from and then in a certain way return to in a higher harmony at the end of history. A history which would complete itself with a return to the original harmony in a higher form. So that's Europe's promise. It's belonging or participating and leading a universal history of man, of all humanity. But it won't strike any of you as surprising to hear that that conception of itself is in trouble. It's not a picture of our own history that can survive for very long an examination of Europe's history, with 2 world wars of European origin, a Holocaust, colonization, decolonization, and so on. So we live in a time in which the self-understanding of Europe, the understanding of Europe as belonging to a philosophical history that I've been talking about, is in a certain way falling apart. Samuel Beckett put it rather wonderfully. I was in fact given this quote by my wife. I wish I'd found it myself, but I didn't. But Samuel Beckett talks about a time-honored conception of humanity in ruins. This was after the Second World War, a time-honored conception of humanity in ruins. We are the inhabitants of those ruins today. And I'll finish now with another quote, this time from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was very aware of himself as inhabiting these European ruins. And he says this: "The earlier culture will become a heap of rubble, and finally a heap of ashes. But spirits will hover over the ashes." Spirits will hover over the ashes. That's my ambition in my own work, to see, as it were, what can survive of Europe's promise beyond its, as it were, originally modern conception of its modernity. I try to find those spirits hovering over the ashes and indeed to welcome them. Thank you very much, Louise.
Thank you, Simon. And yeah, sorry for saying invented the philosophy of history. I meant the philosophy of Europe. It's my over-enthusiasm for LSE research there. So any questions, please do put them in the chat. We've got some time to take them. I'm just going to put a link to your book in the chat. And perhaps this is ambitious, but I wonder if you could briefly summarize what you cover in each volume of the book in terms of Europe's philosophical history.
Okay, here's volume 1, which is about, it's called The Promise of Modernity, and very much in line with what I've just been talking about, that it's the time of European confidence in itself as being at the head of the pack in the history of humanity, of it having this center stage place in that history. And that runs from the Enlightenment up to the outbreak of the Second World War, where by that time, that kind of European self-confidence is in serious trouble. So that's the first volume, The Promise of Modernity, running from about the 1750s up to 1939. The second volume, which is this one is called Beyond Modernity, and it's trying to see what happens to that self-understanding after the Second World War, through the Cold War, into the end of the Cold War, where you have this fascinating event of, in philosophical history, where in the work of Francis Fukuyama, the idea of universal history comes back with a vengeance, saying that there is indeed this single direction towards a final end of man in the movement towards liberal democracy. But I must say, his confidence was not long-lasting. But I want to see, like him, is there anything that can be resurrected in the idea of Europe's promise? But rather than Fukuyama's line, which is to say that we find it within the modern idea of democracy, liberal democracy, I think that we, in a certain way, have to go beyond a standard modern self-understanding. And that's what I tried to develop in the second volume, a way of thinking of our being together, which doesn't forget Europe's history, but as it were, reconfigures it in a way that I think can move it forward in a much more diverse world that we live in today.
No questions popping up in the chat yet. We've still got a few minutes, so if you think of any, please do put them in there. I'll take liberty to ask one more of my own, which is thinking about Brexit and our current, as British people, our current relationship to European identity. How does that?
That's such a good question. Actually, one of the things that is a real centerpiece of the book is looking at the way in which, when philosophers started projecting the idea of a peaceful end of history, what they looked at was the formation first in Europe of a federation of states. And that was in the 1700s, that the philosophers of that time began to project the possibility of a political union in Europe, which of course first developed, as practically speaking, in reality after the Second World War. Now, there's a chapter in my book, in the second volume, where I look at that history, and I look at it precisely, Louise, from the point of view of Britain, of Britain's relationship to this ambition to move towards ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, and the fears that Britain's had about the emergence in that space of a supranational body, a superstate, as it was often called in Britain, increasingly occupying British anxieties about British participation in the European project. It's a fascinating story. It's finally very closely tied up with Britain's understanding of itself as a post-empire country, and the challenge to itself that was being posed by finding itself a new identity as a member state within the European Union, something that it couldn't quite succeed in doing, at least not first go. Whether they'll have a second chance some other time, I don't know.